Welcome to another episode of Inside the Mavs, the official Mavericks podcast of 97.1 The Freak, the Dallas Mavericks Radio Network. My name is Kevin Gray, Mavericks pre and post game host. Appreciate you joining me here on our latest episode as we get you caught up on all things Mavericks basketball. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin Gray Sports, and be sure to download and subscribe to the Inside the Mavs podcast wherever you get your podcast for free on iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. And make sure you give it a 5-star rating and write a review for it while you're there. And you can also check this video out on my YouTube channel at Kevin Gray Sports. We are getting closer and closer to the February 8th NBA trade deadline. Lots of news, rumors, all kinds of stuff to talk about when it comes to this Mavericks basketball team. And happy to be joined by my guest today. He's a salary cap strategist, capologist, writer, and instructor for Sports Business Classroom and writer for Bleacher Report. Joining me on the show today, Eric Pincus joining me here on Inside the Mavs. Eric, how's it going?
It's going well. I'm looking forward to it. Let's talk some hoops. Let's talk some Mavericks.
Yeah, we definitely will. And for you, as we get closer to the NBA trade deadline, what's this time of the year like for you as you continue to put together salary cap information for these teams as they get ready to potentially make some moves and the process that goes into some of that?
Well, a lot of it is projecting not just where we are at this deadline, but where we're going as a collective. So we have new rules that came in starting in July, this past July, with the new collective bargaining agreement that have very restrictive penalties for teams that overspend. And of course, that's a subjective term, overspend, but there's a line or multiple lines. And so, as I have always done, which is sort of go through where I think teams are now, it's become ever more important for me to study and try to project where they go. So, you make that move now. What does that mean for your budget next year? Does that mean that you are strictly the team that you build now? Is that who you are next year? Because you won't have that flexibility unless you further trade out of it. But then what's the point of trading into it if you just have to trade out of it in a few months? Is it worth a playoff run? Are you going to win a championship? Is this a team that you can build around, or does it hamstring you by making this move so that next year you're strictly minimums or very small amount of change? So really interesting new wrinkles. I will say it's easier to make trades than it's probably ever been, at least since I've been covering, and I've been doing this for a couple decades. So it's a lot easier to make trades now. They've loosened the rules in terms of how to get a trade done, unless you're at those upper limits of spending. So that's kind of where I'm at. Still going. I live in LA, so I go to a lot of Lakers and Clippers games. So I see a lot of the league coming through what used to be Staples Center. Was it Crypto.com Arena now?
Mm-hmm.
I still call it Staples. So and other than that, just I guess I have to make my arrangements to go to All-Star shortly. I'm going to go to All-Star in Indiana, so looking forward to that.
Very nice. Well, let's look at that through the lens then of the Mavericks, because this is a team that's dealt with a lot of injury, a lot of player games missed so far this season, a ton of starting different lineups, but at the same time, still with Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving. Kyrie Irving going to be missing his 4th straight game on Monday with the sprained right thumb that he has. So injuries continuing to take a toll on this team. And when we look at it through the lens of the Mavericks, from a tax and an apron threshold, where do the Mavericks sit, and how does that inform us about what potential moves that they can make given their salary cap situation?
Sure. Well, so just some background. I'm not sure how well the listeners know the rules, but basically there are new lines in the sand. There were some old lines, but there are even newer lines. And the first one is the tax. And that has always sort of been a subjective thing. Does the owner or the front office, do they think this team is worth investing in above this tax line where there's extra financial penalty? But the penalty is just money. And, fans tend not to care about the owner's money. They care about winning, right? So that shouldn't necessarily matter from a fan point of view. I get, why it might matter for the team. But there are new lines, or at least one is new, at 100 and let's see, the first apron is at 172 million. The second apron is at 180, we'll call 183 million. And so when the Mavericks signed Seth Curry and Dante Exum, they use one of the triggers of that first apron. So they're a team that has a first apron hard cap at 172 million. So their payroll is not bad. It's about 162. So they aren't necessarily in danger of that. So they have the flexibility to make a trade that adds money. There are other teams that have done the same but are right at that line. They have a little bit of flexibility. I see them as, because of incentives, they have about 8.5 million of flexibility to add. So if they were to make a trade, they can add. Where you start to get a little dangerous in this is you have to look at next year, where if they brought back exactly the same team they have right now, that's going to be about 180 million. And these hard caps and whatnot, they reset every July, so they wouldn't be in that same situation. The second apron, this extra punitive one, the one that involves frozen draft picks and all you have left are minimum contracts, that projects to be about 191 next year. So the Mavericks, if they add, they have to subtract, or at least be mindful of how they would subtract next year, so that they would probably aspire to stay below that number. So I do think there's some flexibility. It just needs to be mindful.
So when we look at it for them, with the 8.5 million that they're below as far as the first apron is concerned, can't exceed that particular threshold, and we start to look at some of the contracts that they have available to them, some of the names and players that a lot of Mavericks fans have considered when it comes to possibly making moves have been guys like a Josh Green, a Jaden Hardy, a Rashawn Holmes potentially, who has a player option going into this upcoming summer, and maybe even a Tim Hardaway Jr., who has a descending contract. When you look at some of those names as far as their contracts are concerned, how would you approach it if you're the Mavericks, maybe looking at a Kyle Kuzma or a PJ Washington, some of these names that have been discussed as far as potential trade targets here?
Well, there, the overarching goal, of course, beyond winning, which is the default, right? In theory, all teams should be striving for that, is to make sure that Luka Doncic wants to be here and be in Dallas. And they have time, because his contract runs through 2027. He has an option after 26. And while that seems like far away, it's rapidly approaching. And the most likely outcome is that he'll take a giant extension, but the Mavericks need to incentivize him just to be, he wants to be happy and probably wants to win. And I can't get in Luka Doncic's mind and tell you what makes him happy, but we can at least assume that if the Mavericks are not a good team for 2-3 years in a row, maybe he doesn't want to be there. I don't know. So the goal is to work within these financial constraints, but to also compete at the highest level, and then give Luka a real desire to want to stay somewhere where he's being successful. So with that in mind, you look at someone like Kyle Kuzma, for instance. And Kuz is at currently about 26, and his money does descend as well. So next year down to about 24, and he has 3 additional years. Really nice offensive player. When he was with the Lakers, he defended well. I'd say when he first came in, he was not a good defender, but watching him closely, he became a very solid, serviceable role player in a rotation, especially defensively, all the way through to a championship. And so in Washington, I don't think he's played any defense, but I don't think the team has either. So you're not necessarily getting, if you're the Mavericks, somebody who's going to change who they are defensively. I don't think the Mavs are built off of being a great defensive team, but you're adding in another really talented offensive player, a high volume scorer, maybe not the most efficient, but I don't know if efficiency is the end all be all. I think winning trumps efficiency. And if you're winning more, if you're scoring more, at least you have that potential. PJ Washington is a different kind of player. He's much cheaper relative to Kuzma. He's about 15.5 next year, about 17 this year, and then he has 1 additional year beyond that. And it's, like I said, descending. So these are flexible contracts. They are probably the kind of contracts Dallas should go after. We could debate on PJ Washington. I would say at least he's less proven. He's been on a crappy Charlotte team, so maybe there's more there to unlock that we haven't seen. Certainly a good player, but it's kind of like maybe he's someone who pushes Dallas over the top. At least we know with Kuzma, he's been at the highest level. He contributed to a championship team. He played as a part of championship level defense. So at least you have that knowledge. It's a little bit less certain with PJ, but Rashawn is a really flexible contract, but a team has to know that if they're acquiring him, he's probably going to opt in and take $13 million next year. And he may or may not be desired for that, what he does at that price. So now you're paying someone to take that. Hardaway's been really good this year, providing that scoring punch and then shooting punch. But he does provide a good amount of salary. He does have another year next year as well at 16. So again, you're looking for a team that is willing to take on salary. Josh Green is one of the younger pieces on this team. His contract's a little complex, but not terribly so, because he's been extended and hasn't started yet. So the trade is a little funky, but I think in the rules as such as they are, it wouldn't be necessarily prohibitive. Certainly you can do Seth Curry, the assets, so to speak. What other teams would desire beyond the players might be draft compensation, and the Mavericks have that 2027 first available. They already owe their 24, which may convey in 25. That blocks 26, and they owe in 29, which blocks 2030. So the only first they can really send outright is 2027. But as you look at Luka and you say, well, he could leave after 26. Worst case scenario, he leaves 26. The team's probably awful in 26, 27. In theory, that could be a top pick. So you would definitely, if you're Dallas, want to try to protect it, but that would be difficult as well because of their other obligations. How they would protect that would have to be creative, and then you're diminishing the value of it if you put too much protection on it. But that's kind of the scenario as I see it. You have, obviously Jaden Hardy, Olivier Maxence Prosper, a couple of young players that might appeal. If the Mavericks were willing to shop Derek Lively, they would have a great return. I just don't think that's on the table for them. I think they need what he does. I think he fits what they do very seamlessly. When you find a young guy who fits and is outperforming their draft status, outperforming their salary, you probably want to hold on to players like that. So if they wanted Pascal Siakam, probably could have had him, costing Derek Lively. I feel like that decision was made on some level. I mean, I can't promise you that conversation happened, but at least the intel suggests that was what was in the conversation, and that was not a place Dallas was willing to go. So I wouldn't expect, if you're listening and you're a Washington fan and we're going to get Derek Lively for Kuzma, or Charlotte for PJ Washington, or anyone else that Dallas might go for. I don't think Lively would be part of that conversation. I think that's kind of setting the table. You've got some contracts that are not great in terms of expiring, but aren't necessarily bad. I don't know if I would move Hardaway based on what he brings. The goal is to add, not subtract. But maybe Josh Green and OMP and a first round pick. It's a dangerous first, because if it doesn't work, it could really set the franchise back if Luka leaves. But then if you don't make a move to succeed, then maybe you're fostering Luka leaving when he may be very happy to stay his entire career as long as the team is competitive. So what do you do? That's up to the Mavs front office, but not entirely, because they can't make a trade without the participation of another team. So it's up to the Mavs front office and the willingness of others to work with them.
Yeah, it's a difficult needle to thread when you're working with timeline picks and also with the new rules that we're looking at. And you were talking about some of the draft compensation that, the Mavericks are looking at. They're already, of course, sending out an unprotected first round pick in 2029 as part of the Kyrie Irving trade. So we talked about some of the, draft compensation that's already, out there and what could be leaving as far as that's concerned. So, and you mentioned Josh Green, because I want people to be able to understand he has this what's called a poison pill restriction. For those that don't know, what does that mean and how it could affect a potential trade when it comes to someone like Josh Green from this team?
Well, it's not terrible is the good news, but it's ultimately an imbalance of what a player's salary is going out versus what it is going in. So the Mavericks sending him out would basically be credited with trading away 4.8 million in salary, but the team acquiring him would have to account for the average salary over his entire extension, which is about 11.4. Now, if this was a larger, like a Tyrese Halliburton type situation, where Halliburton is going from where is he going from? About 6 to 35-ish million. So his average is about 35. So yeah, so his outgoing for Indiana is 5.8, but his incoming would be almost 36. So you could see how there's a major imbalance in how salary is moving. It's less of a problem with Josh Green. It's 5 million out and about 11 and a half in for whoever takes him in. And in the new CBA, they've loosened the trade rules. They've also made them tougher for the teams above those first and second apron. So for the first and second apron teams, this could be a more of an issue. But Charlotte, Washington, the teams that we've been discussing aren't necessarily in those aprons, and the teams that are tend to be teams that are trying to compete for a championship in theory, may not be looking to make this kind of move with Dallas. So I don't think it's necessarily a problem. It could just make things a little more difficult, but if it's a team that's not really worried about the aprons, it shouldn't be a problem. For Dallas, the most they could bring back, if they were sending out 5 million and that was the only salary, then it would be they could take in about double that plus 250. So call it a little bit over 10 million. Let's call it just 10 million flat.
Mm-hmm.
But another team would have to account for 11 million coming in. But again, if they're not in the aprons, they can send out in the neighborhood of 6 million. So looking at it, I don't think the Josh Green contract will be an obstacle. Let's put it that way. It is just a mathematical issue to account for. But with the loosened trade rules and the size of his extension, which is around the mid-level, which is around average player salary, it's not an egregious jump that would make, in my opinion, a Dallas move too complicated to happen. Now, obviously, if you picked a team that was in one of those aprons, it might become more of an issue. So
Sure.
it depends who you're going after. But I don't think it's going to be an issue. I think it's more of an accounting hiccup more than anything else.
Another name that we've heard in potential, discussion when it comes to the Mavericks, we've talked about guys like Kyle Kuzma, PJ Washington. Another name that continues to float about is a name like Andrew Wiggins from Golden State. And Golden State's got some decisions to make when it comes to, Klay Thompson this upcoming summer, what they do with Chris Paul, Draymond Green as well. But for Andrew Wiggins, what does his salary look like and what that looks like for a potential move for a Maverick team that may be looking for, for a guy who may need a fresh start in going from Golden State to somewhere like Dallas?
Well, I mean, with Wiggins, he's ascending as opposed to descending. He's at about 24 up to 26, 28, and then about 30. So there's some length there. He was an all-star starter a couple of years ago, and his game has not lived up to that since. Some of that, he had some personal issues, missed some of the previous season with, I think, some family stuff. It's a risk when, you want to, in theory, get somebody who's on the rise, and you worry, is his dip a trend or an exception to the rule? And is it just playing in a new home, new place, going to reinvigorate him? And that would be a risk that would be something that Golden State would have, or rather Dallas would have to calculate. On the Golden State side, you can argue that maybe they'd be open to some of the contracts that are multi-year, like a Rashawn Holmes, because maybe they're thinking about getting money off in a couple of years. Andrew has 4 total years, and if you're bringing back Rashawn, who has an extra year, you could debate, okay, they're chopping down some of that massive payroll piece by piece, and maybe can't get it all done at once. So maybe that would be why they would go with Holmes, and maybe they would want a Josh Green as a younger piece. You could certainly argue it. It concerns me a little bit from the Dallas side, where as we mentioned, now you're upping your payroll as a team for Wiggins amount, and it's growing. So 26 versus PJ Washington, who is what did we say, 15 or 16? That's a big difference when it comes to next year's numbers, and when you start to look at those aprons for the next year. And while Kuzma is expensive, he's at 23 and a half. It is descending, so next year it'd be 23 and a half. It's less than Wiggins, and you get to a point where every dollar matters. And if you're doing a PJ Washington, maybe you're not getting someone who's proven, but you're also not paying that same price. So that's where it's a player evaluation, it's a budget evaluation, and then what are you getting off of in salary? If you're getting off of Rashawn and let's say Josh Green, you're pulling off about $25 million off your books next year. So if you're just replacing that with a Wiggins, which is maybe a little more expensive, but in the ballpark, or a Kuzma, that puts you in the neighborhood of about 178 or so. So there's, we said it was about 190 something. So there's some flexibility under that second apron. Again, there's the tax line, which is just a penalty the team has to pay. I don't think fans should necessarily concern themselves with that. If a team is trying to win, that line is one that you're going to cross. The first apron has some restrictions, but it's not completely punitive. It does limit what you can do, but it's that second apron that I think teams are going to treat as a hard cap. And I think that's where some of those moves where, now you're like, well, maybe Hardway is the guy you send out because of his 16 million next year, as opposed to Josh Green or whatever, who's a 13 million. But then there's the question of value and who's doing what and why are they doing it. And if Josh Green is the youthful consideration versus Hardaway, who's a good player, but maybe not the reason why a team moves off of a good player. So obviously there's a lot to consider, again, because it's not like Dallas has a menu to choose from.
Sure.
You might end up in a situation where you have 1, 2, or 3 possible moves that you can make. But a lot of times it's 0 to 1, and it's just, yes, you have moves that you can make, but they're unfavorable to the team. So sure, Dallas could probably make 3 or 4 trades today, none of which that they would be comfortable making. So it's about getting something that, this is not unique to Dallas, it's for any team, something that you can live with, something that you feel moves the needle forward for whatever your goals are. And in Dallas's goal, it would be trying to win now, trying to win over the next few years, and trying to make sure that Luke is happy, presumably because he's in a winning environment. And how much do you risk what happens if it doesn't work? And so I think the answer there is in giving up what they gave up to get Kyrie, who is a player who is super talented, but has had some moments of unreliability in terms of just showing up, whether it was personal stuff or suspension related. It was a risk that Dallas was willing to take on, believing that their culture, their infrastructure would provide a good place for Kyrie to be successful, and they were willing to risk what you mentioned, unprotected first down the road. These are the kind of risks they were willing to make. I would assume they're still on that track, but that player coming back has to be someone who fits with Kyrie, fits with Luka, presumably fits with Derek Lively, and whoever else you feel has to be in the rotation, whether it's a Maxey or a Grant Williams or Dwight Powell, whoever it is that
Sure.
they deem to be foundational to what they're trying to accomplish. Maybe that's Hardaway, maybe that's not. I would argue, just based on who they are, they kind of need Hardaway. I mean, in how he's grown last year or a year before, maybe I would have said differently, but I think that he's become a really integral part of what they're trying to accomplish offensively. And so if you lose him, that's fine if you've improved upon him. But if the goal is to just improve on one player a little bit, does that move the needle, or does keeping Hardaway and getting one more piece really move the needle and push them forward into something that can really compete at the highest level?
Yeah, the Mavericks have shot the three ball extremely well, and Tim Hardaway has been a big part of that. Him and Luka Doncic helping this team shoot a bunch of threes and make a bunch of threes so far this year. So he's been a terrific player and a potential sixth man of the year candidate for the Mavericks. So it would be difficult at this point to see Tim Hardaway be parted away from, but at the same time, if that can help you maybe improve your team, maybe that's something they have to consider. And along those lines, from your understanding and what you've been able to gather around this team as well, what is your understanding about how this team is viewed around the league when it comes to potentially making something happen at the trade deadline based off of what they have available and some of the restrictions that may not allow them or maybe allow them to make some moves that may help improve this team?
Right. Well, I talked to a lot of executives with other teams and agents and other people in the industry, and I can get a sense of what people are talking about. I can talk to some people with the Mavericks who I have some friends in the organization, but truthfully, when I talk to an organization, I rarely talk about their organization. It's more gossiping about others. I don't want to put people in a position where they're um, talking to someone in the media who is saying things they shouldn't. While I'm very trustworthy, if you tell me something in confidence, I haven't put any. So I don't usually put that kind of pressure on anyone I know in an organization. So, in other words, I can share the gossip, but I can't share like, oh, I talked to Mark about this, and
Sure.
I talked to the GM, and this is not coming from the Mavs. This is coming from other organizations or agents. And the buzz has been that Mavericks are more of a buyer and are looking to do something that firmly gives them a foothold to compete every year, at least second, third, fourth round, get to the finals. However, it's not a team that's, just kind of messing around to just make the playoffs. There are some teams where I could argue they've made moves that cement them as playoff teams, but limit them as upside teams. You have someone like Luka, who's arguably a top talent in the league. I mean, we could debate if he's number one or if he's number five. I think you would have a hard time getting to five.
Sure.
Are there four guys better than Luka? We could debate Giannis or something, or Jokic or Embiid. We can have those conversations, but you have a singular talent, what looks to be a generational talent. And how do you, number one, as we talked about, make him happy? The vibe on Luka is that he's not somebody who needs to go to some quote bigger franchise in terms of maybe city or market. Dallas is a great market. It's a great NBA franchise. Is it is it in San Francisco or Los Angeles or New York? Is that a good thing or a bad thing for Luka? I don't know, but I don't. The buzz is that those are. It's not like some bigger city is a draw. Is what the buzz is now. Again, who knows what Luka actually wants? But the vibe is that the right move or two could make him a Maverick for life, just like Dirk was. And so, I think that's what people expect the Mavericks to be doing. That they're willing to sacrifice some of their youth, but not Derek Lively. That Hardaway, in theory, could be moved, but he's pretty valuable to them. So maybe they're working around the edges, and that first has real value because of just that possibility that he does leave. And you could be getting, if you get a 27 unprotected, you could be getting, the next Victor Wembanyama or whatever at the Mavericks' expense. And so if you're Dallas and you're like, okay, if we do these moves, we'll compete for a title. Luka will stick around longer. That pick will probably be at worst 20, right? If we're a playoff team, should be in the neighborhood of 20. Maybe it's 25, maybe it's 28. Maybe the Mavericks are barely getting in through the play-in down the road, but that's not what they would be thinking. They'd be thinking if you're giving up the 20th pick, then you're fine. It's just that you have the risk, and there's risk of doing nothing. and that would be maybe not competing, eventually souring the relationship with Luka, who wants, in theory, a reason to stay. So you want to give him that reason to stay. And so that, that's the kind of buzz around the league as far as who the Mavericks are. Every team is sort of working within these constraints now of the hard cap, which is, an optional hard cap, that second apron, but teams are treating it like it's a hard cap. And not all. Phoenix, the Clippers, still Golden State, it's too hard for them to get down too quickly. But in terms of the moves that the Mavs make, just look 1 year ahead and make sure that it doesn't do something that is going to put them into the 200 range or something like that, which is not really tenable for a team. And it's less about ownership being cheap and more about, if you don't have the tools to build, it's really hard to build. If you can't make trades, or you can, but you can't add salary via trade, you can't aggregate, combine players together to bring in other players, you only have the minimums. That's fine if you have a team that is like the best team in the league,
Sure.
and you don't really need to do much. If you have in the prime, Steph and Clay and Draymond and KD, then yeah, you can afford to just sign minimum guys each year and just sort of mind the numbers at that point. But for Dallas's case, just look at the numbers ahead. I do think there's some flexibility. I do think Kuzma is certainly available. I don't think the Wizards are rushing to trade him because they don't have to trade him at this deadline. It's a little different for like a Tyus Jones who's expiring, where if they don't trade Tyus Jones, then he leaves and they don't get any value for having him. Kuzma, they worked a nice extension. It's descending. It's not very long. It's what I would consider an attractive contract for a player who maybe isn't top 10 in the league or top 15, but is certainly a good starter and a champion and somebody who can help. PJ Washington is cheaper, and maybe that's the reason why you go in that direction. Wiggins is the most expensive and is in a potential descent from his peak. That concerns me. So I would worry about that one in particular. I would probably stay away from that. But maybe he's the cheapest to get because of those concerns, and maybe the numbers work for Dallas where the aprons in the future aren't a problem. And if that's the case, it's certainly a move. Kyrie was certainly a move. It wasn't a low risk move. That was a risk move, but Kyrie's incredibly talented, and Wiggins is also very talented. Plays defense, can score. Just sometimes it seems like over the course of his career, sometimes it doesn't feel, or it hasn't felt like he's always brought everything all at once, except for that 1 year where he brought everything that he has at his disposal and was absolutely tremendous. And, probably why they won that championship that year. Obviously, Steph and all that.
Sure.
Not the main reason, but they probably aren't the same team that year without Wiggins being what he was.
Last thing before we let you go here today, when you look at this trade market and this deadline in particular, what has the information told you about what kind of market this is relative to some of the guys that have been reportedly available, and how that can inform what we may see as far as some moves and what that may affect the Mavericks as far as what they potentially do as well?
Well, it's an interesting market because we have new rules, and so we're in a certain level of just uncertainty of how things are. Last year there was sort of an adjustment to the market because of the play-in tournament, and that's been growing over the course of years, where the play-in was an unofficial thing, and it started in the pandemic, and then started to play with it. It became, this is how it is now. And so in the past, if it was 8 teams per conference, maybe 10 were still competitive up to the deadline, and so 10 in each. So that would be 20 teams. You'd have 10 teams that were probably selling in some form. Maybe one of those teams was trying to jump up, but maybe one of those top 20 teams was trying to move down anyway and knew that they weren't, so, but generally speaking, there would be maybe 10 sellers thinking about the future. Now we have you have 10 that make it, but then there's probably 12 that are in the range of making it. So now that's 24 teams. So now you maybe only have 6 sellers. And so that's only 4 different, but there's only 30 teams. So it's a big percentage, right? And so I think last year the trade market was really bottlenecked. And then at some point, teams were looking at Chicago and Toronto last year and wondering, were they going to sell? Were they going to sell? Were they going to sell? And the answer was no, they weren't going to sell. So they didn't sell. But there was almost like a deluge a rush of trades at the deadline, and we had a very busy trade season. It just all happened at the end.
Mm-hmm.
What's been different with this is that, number one, in the new CBA, the trade rules have been loosened. So it's easier to make trades in terms of salary matching, again, except for those teams that are above those certain levels. Although even this year, it is still looser now than it will be after this summer. After this season, for those second apron teams and even for the first apron teams, it becomes harder to make trades, even more so than it is now. But it still is. You still have the play-in to consider. You have these loosened rules, and going into the year, it's been okay. Well, what is it going to be like? And at first, it looked like it would be similar to last year, where we weren't sure who was going to sell. Would there be a bottleneck? But then we've had like a Siakam trade, and we've had Detroit make a trade, and we've had trades semi-consistently. So I feel like we've seen an uptick. So I think that the overall market has been a little bit more fluid, which is, I think, the goal of the NBA, and I think the NBPA, the Players Association in partnership, I think that was part of what went into this new CBA, was an intention to loosen trade rules. That's from conversations I've had with people, and then also if you just look at some of the rule changes, they're pretty clear that that's where they're going. And but because of that, maybe we've had more trades already. There's not going to be, we've had OG traded and Siakam traded. So like,
yeah,
does Toronto continue? Do they, first of all, like, yes, they could still make trades, but their 2 most desirable players have been moved. But they can move Bruce Brown, they can move Gary Trent, they can move Dennis Schroeder, etc. So there are other moves that could happen. So, but that their top guys were moved already. What does that mean for Toronto at the deadline? They're no longer like the focus. They're just sort of like, yeah, maybe they make another move. So I wonder how much of, like, we've already seen a lot of them. And so we have an average deadline where it's not outrageous, or maybe there's more saved up and we'll see a whole bunch of flurry. So I don't know the answer. And that's, what, it'd be pretty boring if every game you watched you knew the outcome ahead of time, right? Or of the trade deadline. So it does make it, that's some of the joy of it. I feel like I'm reasonably good at setting the table of what the discussions are. And obviously I get, I didn't see the Bagley to Detroit coming. I mean, I knew Detroit was selling, and I knew Washington was flexible, but there's no way to predict everything. But I feel like I do a decent job of at least understanding what the decisions are. And for Dallas, it's not a sell, it's a buy. And for the reasons we described, and they do have some pieces. When I say pieces, I mean, the picks, and at least the pick individual, and then some players. I don't like to refer to them as like, non-human terms, but from a chessboard perspective of making moves, if you want to call them pieces, that's what I refer to it. These are obviously, real people whose families need to uproot, and it's not a small thing when a person gets traded. But from the chessboard point of view, the Mavericks have some pieces and are willing buyers, but probably within the constraints of making sure that next year's payroll doesn't balloon out of control too much. So keep an eye on that. If you're doing some Dallas Mavericks fake trades, just run the budget for next year to make sure it doesn't get out of control.
Everyone loves firing up the trade machines to see what they could do to try to match salary and get players to get to where they want them to go and that kind of thing. It's always an interesting time of the year. Eric, can you tell the folks the work that you're doing, where they can find you to be able to get more of what you're doing these days?
Well, you can find me on, I guess, what's called X now, or Twitter, but it's kind of like Staples Center. I'm still going to call it Twitter. At Eric Pincus, ERICPINCUS. I, of course, publish for Bleacher Report pretty regularly. lots of fake trades. My editors have, I don't want to say fallen in love with that, but they know that I'm capable of constructing some crazy combinations. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, I like it as, sort of an educational exercise, because through Sports Business Classroom, which is where I teach, a lot of what I do is teaching people about the industry, trying to help them get jobs, help them find entry points on how can you get in, be with a team or on the agent side or with a shoe company or a broadcast company, all the different arms and legs of this industry. But mostly my focus obviously is the salary cap and the collective bargaining agreement, all the rules and whatnot. So you can go to sportsbusinessclassroom.com or just follow us on sports BIZCLASS on Twitter /X. And we have some great content there. Some from our alumni, our students who I work with and make sure they can get a chance to showcase what they're working on and what they've learned and what they can exercise, and others just tracking all of this nonsense to help the fans figure out, well, wait, why can't my team do this, or how does my team get better, which I think is really how I started on this journey a long time ago, which is trying to figure out, oh wait, there's a roadmap here, there's a set of rules on how a team plays the game outside the 48 minutes that are in an NBA basketball game. So that to me is where I enjoyed the most. Although sometimes when you watch Luka do what he just did the other day, that beats all of it. It trumps everything. When you see somebody do some crazy, or I was watching, I was actually out at not a sports bar, but like a restaurant that had TVs everywhere, while the Lakers and the Warriors were going toe to toe with LeBron and Steph. So when you see that and Luka doing what he did, or Booker on the same day doing what he was doing, gotta love the game. So good fun, and whatever I can do to help, just reach out.
Yeah, the game is tremendous right now with the amount of offensive talent that we see. Is just the talent overall in the league is at an all-time high, and this weekend was past week was a tremendous example of some of that. So, Eric, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate you hanging out with me here on the Inside the Mavs podcast. Terrific stuff here, and hopefully a little bit more of an education for those who are looking to do some of the similar things to be able to have a better idea of what the Mavs could be doing. So, really appreciate you hanging out with us here today.
All right, Kevin, anytime. Appreciate it, and good luck to the Mavs at the deadline. I'm fascinated to see what they do, because I think there's some potential there. I'm just curious to see, now that we've set the table, I'm curious to see what they order on that menu. So looking forward to it.
That'll do it for this episode of Inside the Mavs. Again, thank you to Eric Pincus for joining me here on today's episode. You can download and subscribe to the Inside the Mavs podcast wherever you get podcasts for free. Give it a 5-star rating and write a review for it while you're there. And make sure that you can check out this video on my YouTube channel at Kevin Gray Sports. And don't forget, you can download the Inside the Mavs podcast, the official Mavericks podcast of 97.1 The Freak for the Dallas Mavericks Radio Network. Again, I'll talk to you on Wednesday here on another episode of Inside the Mavs. We'll talk to you later. Peace.